The storm had been rolling for hours, beating down on the plains with a fury that rattled windows and made even the coyotes go quiet. Inside his weathered cabin, Elijah Boone sat with his boots off, pipe in his hand, listening to the roof groan under the weight of rain. Then came the sound, not the wind, not the creak of timbers, but sharp and deliberate, 3 knocks at his door. By the time he swung it open, rifle at his side, he found a girl no older than 12 standing there, drenched to the bone, shivering, and holding tight to a bundle wrapped in burlap, her eyes wide, dark, and filled with something that wasn't just fear but determination, met his. And that bundle, what she carried pressed against her chest, would end up shaking the whole town before the week was through. Now, Elijah wasn't the kind of man folks in town called friendly. He lived a few miles out, too far for most to bother with, and he liked it that way. Some said he'd once been a soldier in the war between the states. Others claimed he'd run cattle for a Texas outfit and got soured on people after being double-crossed. He never corrected the rumors. Truth was, Elijah Boone had seen enough of men's cruelty and women's lies to trust only his land, his horse, and the worn Bible his mother left him. At 40 he carried himself with the hard grace of someone who'd done more work than talking. Tall, with sun-creased skin and a beard streaked with gray, Elijah looked older than his years, but his eyes still had fire. His spread was small, no more than a dozen head of cattle and a mule stubborn as a rock. Enough to keep him fed, but never enough to make him rich. That didn't trouble him. The prairie was wide and empty, and Elijah preferred it that way. What he couldn't escape, though, was the loneliness. Nights stretched long. The wind sang through the cracks in the boards. Sometimes in the dead silence he thought he heard his own thoughts echo too loud. That night the storm hit like the hand of God. Lightning split the sky, rain hammered down, and the creek behind his cabin swelled and hissed. Elijah sat with a lantern burning low, patching a saddle strap, when he heard the knock. At first he thought it was a branch. Then it came again, insistent, 3 hard raps that didn't sound like nature. Elijah set down the leather, grabbed his rifle, and moved slow to the door. His cabin wasn't a place strangers came to, not unless they were desperate or foolish or both. When he swung it open, the sight near knocked the breath from him. There she stood, rain plastering her dress to her thin frame, skin dark as rich soil, braids undone and dripping. Barefoot, toes caked in mud. Her face was young, too young to be out here alone, but her eyes carried years no child should know. She held a bundle tight against her chest, wrapped in burlap, like it was the only thing she had left worth guarding. "Please," she whispered, her teeth chattering, "Sir, I need help." Now, Elijah Boone was a man of instinct. Instinct told him this didn't make sense. What was a black orphan girl doing miles from any road in the middle of a storm, knocking on his door? The world wasn't kind to girls like her. Hell, it wasn't kind to most folks, and he knew letting her in meant opening himself to trouble. But there was something about her voice, trembling but steady, that pulled him. He lowered the rifle. "You alone?" She nodded, eyes dropping to the floorboards of his porch. "What's in the bundle?" She clutched it tighter, shaking her head. "It's mine. Please don't take it." Elijah could have turned her away. Many men would, but he saw the way her lips were turning blue from the cold, the way her knees looked ready to give. He stepped back from the doorway. "Get inside. You'll catch your death out here." Elijah shut the door against the storm and tossed another log onto the fire. She stood stiff near the hearth, too wary to sit, her small hands never letting go of that bundle. "You got a name?" Elijah asked. She hesitated. "Clara." "Well, Clara, you're safe for now. Sit, warm yourself. I'll fetch you something dry." He found one of his old shirts, long enough to hang past her knees, and turned his back while she changed. When she settled by the fire, wrapped in the oversized shirt, Elijah studied her from the shadow. She was bone-thin, her cheeks hollow, but there was a spark in her eyes. Clara ate the cornbread he set before her like she hadn't tasted food in days. Still, she kept glancing at the bundle on her lap, guarding it like a wolf pup. "You gonna tell me what's in there?" he asked finally. Her chin lifted. Stubborn. "Not yet." Elijah let it go for the moment. He'd learned not to press too hard when a soul wasn't ready. But he knew whatever she carried, it wasn't just scraps of cloth. Something about the way she guarded it told him it mattered. The storm raged on, rattling the shutters and howling across the plains. Elijah leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling, watching Clara fight sleep. He wondered where she'd come from, how she'd found his door, and why trouble always seemed to find him when he least wanted company. Yet, in some corner of his chest he hadn't felt in years, he knew the truth. That knock at midnight wasn't chance. It was the start of something that would tear through the quiet of his life like the storm outside. And when the town heard what she brought with her, there'd be no turning back. Morning came slow after the storm. The plains were washed clean, air sharp with the smell of wet sage and mud. Elijah Boone woke early, as always, stoking the fire before stepping outside to check the sky. The land was quiet now, but his mind was. Behind him, inside the cabin, the girl slept curled in his shirt, that bundle clutched to her chest, like a lifeline. Elijah spat into the mud. He knew what men would say if they saw her here. A black child showing up at his door. Folks would whisper first, then they'd accuse, then they'd judge. That was the rhythm of small towns out west. Still, he hadn't turned her away, and he wasn't about to now. Yowka. When Clara woke, she didn't ask for breakfast. She asked where she was. Elk Creek. Elijah answered. Half-day's ride from town. My spread's a few miles out. Her eyes darted to the window, as if measuring how far she'd run. Don't worry, Elijah added. Ain't nobody here but me. And you. She nodded, silent, then loosened her grip on the bundle just long enough to rub her eyes. Elijah caught a glimpse, a scrap of old leather tied around the burlap. Initials burned into it. He didn't press, not yet. You got family? He asked. Her lips tightened. For a moment, Elijah thought she wouldn't answer. Then, soft as the wind, she said, not anymore. It took hours, with long silences in between. But her story began to spill out. She'd been born in a wagon camp down near Abilene. Her mama a cook for trail hands. Her daddy, a horsebreaker, who didn't last long once his back gave out. They were poor, always moving, scraping by on whatever work came. By the time Clara turned 8, fever had taken her mama. 2 winters later, her daddy was gone too, trampled by a bronc no man should have tried to tame. After that, Clara drifted. She lived with a colored family outside Fort Worth for a spell, helped care for babies smaller than her. Then a preacher's wife took her in, promising school and scripture, but it ended with too many beatings and not enough bread. Clara ran again. She had no place to belong, no kin to claim her, but she had the bundle. That much she kept secret. Listening to her, Elijah felt something stir he hadn't let surface in years. Pity, mixed with anger, at the world that left kids to fend like strays. He wanted to ask more about the bundle, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. Instead he said, town's got a schoolhouse. Might be you'd do better there. Teacher's a good woman. Clara shook her head fast. Can't stay in town. They'll take it from me. It. Her arms folded around the bundle. What I got. What my mama gave me before she died. Folks always try to take things. Elijah leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke curling. He'd seen men kill each other over cattle, over land, even over a deck of cards. But he'd never seen a child guard something with that kind of fire. Elijah had ridden into town for flour and coffee. At the general store, old Mrs. Hammond raised an eyebrow the moment he stepped in. Heard you've got company out your way, she said, her voice sweet as honey but sharp underneath. Elijah grunted. Storm drove her in. Girl needed help. She said, weighing sugar behind the counter. Strange how these things happen. Folks are saying she wandered straight to your door, almost like she knew where she was headed. He didn't like her tone, but he didn't. Town ran on talk faster than a telegraph, and he knew by nightfall every saloon stool and church pew would carry the story. Elijah Boone, loner rancher, taking in a black orphan girl. On the ride back he cursed himself for not thinking ahead. People wouldn't let this lie, not in Elk Creek. That evening, Elijah tried again. You trust me, Clara? He asked. Her eyes narrowed, cautious. Why? Because whatever's in that bundle, if it's worth protecting, you can't do it alone. Storms like the one last night don't care about secret. For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly, She unwrapped the burlap just enough for him to see. Inside was a leather satchel, cracked but sturdy, with a brass clasp. On the front flap carved deep were the initials HT. Elijah's gut tightened. He knew those letters. Henry Talbot, one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, a man whose reach stretched from the saloon to the courthouse, and a man Elijah Boone wanted no dealings with. "How in blazes did you come by this?" he asked, his voice low. Clara's hands trembled as she pulled the burlap back. "It was Mama's. She said never to let it go, not even if it cost me everything. Said it was proof." "Proof of what?" Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "That what he stole wasn't his. He'd hoped the bundle was nothing more than keepsakes, maybe a locket or some letters, but Henry Talbot's name, that was trouble." He looked at the girl, small, worn thin, yet clutching that satchel like it was the spine that held her upright. "You know what this means, don't you?" he said. Clara met his eyes. "It means I can't run anymore." Elijah rubbed his jaw. He wasn't a man who invited fights, but neither did he back down from one when it came knocking. And right now, trouble wasn't just knocking. It was already sitting by his fire. The wind shifted outside, carrying the smell of mesquite smoke from a distant camp. Elijah knew men were already talking in town, and it wouldn't be long before Talbot's ears caught wind of a girl with his satchel. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, then another. He thought about sending her on, washing his hands of it. A smarter man would. But Clara's eyes, tired, stubborn, unbroken, kept him from saying the words. Instead, he told her, "You can stay here, but you need to understand. Once Talbot knows, he'll come look, and when he does, there'll be no easy way out." Clara nodded once, like she'd already decided long before she reached his door. Neither of them could yet see the firestorm it would bring down on Elk Creek. By the third day, Elk Creek buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Folks didn't need much to set their tongues wagging, and the sight of Elijah Boone riding in with flour and a pair of boots, small enough for a child, had lit the fuse. By sundown, the saloon carried more stories than whiskey. Some swore he'd found Clara wandering the creek bank, and took pity. Others claimed she was kin of his, though no one could remember Elijah ever having a brother or sister. The ugliest voices whispered that he had no business taking in a black orphan, that it was unnatural, that it would stir up trouble, and trouble in Elk Creek had a way of multiplying fast. At that night, the Lucky Spur saloon swelled with smoke and suspicion. Men leaned on the bar, voices pitched low, tossing cards into the pot as if gossip were part of the game. "Boone's always been a strange one," muttered Hank Roper, a ranch hand whose tongue wagged faster than his brain. "Living out there alone, now bringing in strays. Mark my words, that girl's carrying something that ain't hers." The barkeep polished a glass, slow and careful. "Or maybe Boone just did what none of you would, showed kindness." Hank snorted. "Kindness don't put food on the table. Mark me, it'll bite him." Let's see. By Sunday, whispers seeped into the church pews. Reverend Matthews preached about charity and the Good Samaritan, but more than one pair of eyes slid toward Elijah when he strode in with Clara at his side. Clara sat quiet, hands folded, that satchel never far from reach. She felt the stares heavy, sharp, cutting deeper than any storm wind. Elijah noticed too. He kept his jaw tight, one hand resting on the pew like it might steady him from breaking under the weight of judgment. After service, Mrs. Hammond cornered him outside. "Elijah," she said, voice dripping honey, "that child's better off with the orphan home in Fort Worth. Safer, proper. Folks can mind their own." Elijah cut her short. His voice was calm, but his eyes said more. Clara, standing beside him, felt a rare flicker of safety in that moment. But safety didn't last long. 2 days later, a calf broke loose near the edge of Boone's spread. The animal, spooked by a coyote, plunged straight into the swollen creek. Elijah and Clara heard the bawling cry from the corral. Before Elijah could saddle his horse, Clara was already running, barefoot, dress whipping around her knees. "Elijah, it'll drown," she shouted, splashing into the icy water. The creek tore at her, but she fought through, teeth gritted, arms straining against the current, as she grabbed the calf by its slick hide. Elijah reached her moments later, rope in hand, but by then she'd already hauled the bawling creature toward the bank. Together, soaked and breathless, they pulled it free. When they stumbled back to the cabin, Clara's lips were blue, her body shaking, but in her eyes burned something fierce, a refusal to break, the same fire that had carried her across miles of country with that satchel in her arms. Elijah wrapped her in a blanket, muttering, "Fool girl, you'll kill yourself one of these days." But the corner of his mouth betrayed him, curving with pride. Words spread quick. By week's end, folks in Elk Creek weren't just whispering about the orphan girl at Boone's cabin. They were talking about how she'd braved the creek to save a calf. "She's got grit, I'll give her that," said one rancher at the store. "Grit don't change her skin," another shot back, though his voice lacked conviction. Still, the story carried weight. Even men who scorned Elijah found themselves grudgingly impressed. And Clara, though she never sought attention, was no longer just a mystery. She was a girl who'd risked her neck for something that wasn't even hers. Yet, for every whisper of admiration, there was another of danger. Henry Talbot, whose initials burned on the satchel, had men listening in every corner, and when word reached him of a girl living under Boone's roof, guarding something close, his expression hardened. If Elk Creek thought its gossip was harmless, they were dead wrong. The talk that swirled in church pews and saloon corners was already riding towards something darker. The town had judged, some softening, some sharpening their knives. Clara had shown courage that no one expected from a girl her size. But courage wasn't enough to stop the storm that was gathering, and Henry Talbot wasn't a man who forgave secrets. Henry Talbot didn't come riding himself, not at first. Men like him rarely dirtied their boots, unless the matter demanded it. No, he sent others, 2 riders in dust-stained coats, eyes mean as rattlers, guns hanging low on their hips. They showed up at Elijah Boone's spread just after dawn, when the dew still clung to the grass and Clara was out back gathering kindling. Elijah spotted them before they reached the porch. He stepped out, rifle slung casual but ready. "Mornin'," the taller of the two said, reining up. His grin was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're looking for something that don't belong. Figured maybe you've seen it." Elijah spat into the dirt. "Don't much care for riddles." The shorter man leaned forward in his saddle. "Leather satchel, brass clasp. Belongs to Mr. Talbot. We know it's here." Behind Elijah, Clara froze. She clutched the kindling so tight one stick snapped in her hands. The taller man's grin faltered. "Careful, Boone. Talbot don't take kindly to thieves, and I don't take kindly to men trespassing on my land." Elijah shifted the rifle just enough to make his point. The riders exchanged a glance, then wheeled their horse. But as they rode off, the short one called over his shoulder, "You just bought yourself more trouble than you can hold." Elijah watched them vanish in the dust, jaw tight. He knew Talbot wouldn't stop. The man had money, power, and half the county in his pocket. A satchel tied to his name wasn't just property, it was leverage, maybe even ruin, if its contents ever saw daylight. Inside, Clara sat by the hearth, bundle clutched to her chest like a shield. "They'll come again," she said. Elijah set his rifle against the wall, poured black coffee into a tin cup. "Yeah, and next time they won't be asking so polite." Clara's voice cracked. "If I leave, maybe they won't bother you." He turned, eyes hard. "Girl, you showed up at my door with that satchel, not by chance but by some twist of providence. I ain't about to shove you back into the storm now." Her gaze held his, fierce despite the tears brimming. "Then we have to show the town. Let him see what he's hiding." Elijah didn't answer right away. He thought of the church pews, the saloon tables, the way men looked at him like he was already half a stranger. Exposing Talbot meant taking on more than one man. It meant crossing the whole order of things in Elk Creek. But when he looked at Clara, thin and trembling yet unyielding, he knew some fights chose you. Deeds, contracts, letters written in Talbot's hand. Elijah scanned them, his face darkening with each line. Land transfers, signed under duress. Cattle tallies doctored to cheat sharecroppers. And one document more damning than all. A deed for acreage outside Elk Creek, signed by a widow who died the very day before her mark was put to paper. Elijah laid the page down slow. "These ain't just papers, Clara. They're a rope fit to hang him." Clara's voice was a whisper. "Mama said Talbot stole from our people. Said this would prove it. That's why she hid it, told me never to let it go. By week's end, it wasn't just whispers anymore. Talbot himself rode into Elk Creek, his black stallion gleaming, his coat pressed sharp as a blade. He took his place in the saloon, buying rounds, shaking hands, his smile wide enough to hide the steel in his eyes. Word spread. He'd called a meeting in the town square come Saturday. Elijah knew what it meant. Talbot wasn't just hunting for a satchel. He was setting the stage to brand them thieves before they could brand him worse. Saturday dawned hot and cloudless. Townsfolk gathered, ranch hands, shopkeepers, mothers with babes on their hips. Talbot stood on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by the same two riders who'd come to Elijah's door. Elijah walked in slow, Clara beside him, satchel in her arms. Every head turned. The crowd hushed, the air thick with dust and tension. Talbot's smile sharpened. "Well, Boone, you've brought my property back. Good man. Hand it over and this matter dies here." Elijah's voice cut through the square. "Ain't your property, Talbot. It's proof of the lies you've been feeding this town for years." Gasps rippled. Clara stepped forward, small but unshaken, holding the satchel out for all to see. It was between Henry Talbot and the truth. The square bristled with silence. A town caught between loyalty and justice, wealth and conscience. The town square had never felt so still. Men who usually couldn't keep their mouths shut during a poker game stood frozen. Women with baskets of bread or mending in their laps forgot the chores they'd brought along. Even the horses tied to the rails seemed uneasy, hooves shifting on the packed dirt. At the center of it all stood Henry Talbot, his fine coat catching the morning light, smile carved in stone. Beside him, Elijah Boone and Clara, a slip of a girl holding the satchel that had drawn all of Elk Creek into its storm. Talbot spread his arms wide, voice rolling smooth across the crowd. "Folks, what you see here is nothing more than lies carried by a vagabond child and a bitter rancher who never prospered on his own. That satchel belongs to me. Hand it over, Boone, and we'll be done." But Elijah didn't move. He looked at Clara, then at the crowd, and spoke like a man who'd carried truth too long to keep it buried. "What's inside ain't mine, and it ain't hers. It belongs to all of you. Proof of who's been stealing from this town while smiling in your face." Clara stepped forward, her voice small but clear. "This is my mama's gift. She told me never to let it go because it held the truth." She knelt untying the satchel, the burlap fell away, and Elijah lifted the first deed for all to see. His voice carried, sharp as the crack of a rifle. "This here says Widow Harper sold her land to Talbot the day after she died. Anyone remember the widow? Anyone remember her marking papers from the grave?" Murmurs spread like wildfire. Widow Harper had been beloved, her passing mourned. To hear her name tied to fraud was a wound ripped open. Elijah held another page high. "This one's a tally for cattle, signed by men I know couldn't read their own names. Talbot's numbers claimed twice the head they had, and guess where the rest ended up?" He jabbed a finger toward Talbot. Right in his. The square erupted in gasps and angry shouts. Men who'd worked long, back-breaking days for Talbot suddenly saw the theft spelled plain. Clara pulled another letter, her small hands trembling but steady. "This one says my daddy's land was never his at all. But it was. I was born there. Mama said Talbot forged papers to take it away." Her voice broke, but she stood tall. "That's why she made me carry this. So one day people would know." Talbot's face darkened, his smile cracking into something cruel. He stepped forward, voice booming. "These are forgery, lies spread by a girl who don't even belong here. You'll trust her word over mine." A voice rang out from the crowd, old Sam Dillard, who'd lost his grazing land a decade back. "I'll trust what's in my own eyes, Talbot. That's my mark on that paper, and I never signed it." Another shout followed, then another. Men and women surged closer, fury building like thunder. For the first time Talbot looked less like a master of men and more like a fox cornered. He reached for his pistol, but Elijah was faster. His rifle came up, steady as stone. "Don't," Elijah said, voice low but carrying across the square. "Not here, not today." For a long, dangerous moment, The two men locked eyes, one with power built on lies, the other with nothing but truth and a steady hand. Then Talbot slowly let the pistol drop back into its holster. The Reverend stepped forward, voice shaking but firm. "I've heard enough. If there's justice left in Elk Creek, it won't come from Talbot's pocket. It'll come from these papers, and from us standing together." The crowd roared its agreement. Men tore the documents from Talbot's grasping hands, passing them around, each proof heavier than iron. Sheriff Holbrook, who'd long bowed to Talbot's purse, finally found his spine. He pushed through the crowd, took the satchel from Clara, and declared, "These'll be sent to the judge in Abilene. Until then, Henry Talbot, you'll answer here, same as any thief." Talbot cursed, but the sheriff's men dragged him toward the jailhouse. His empire, built on lies, cracked and crumbled before the eyes of the very town he thought he owned. When it was done, Clara stood in the square, shaking but unbroken. Folks who'd looked at her with suspicion days before now nodded with respect. Women offered her food, men tipped their hats. One little boy whispered to his mother loud enough for Clara to hear, "She's braver than any man here." Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Clara. Your mom'd be proud." She looked up at him, eyes wet but shining. "I didn't do it alone." The satchel's papers rode to Abilene, where judges and lawyers picked them apart. But in Elk Creek the truth had already landed. Talbot's name was mud, his holdings divided, his men scattered. As for Elijah Boone, the man once called a loner, found his cabin no longer so empty. Clara stayed, not as a burden but as kin. She helped with the cattle, read from the Bible in the evenings, and filled the silence of long nights with stories of her mama and daddy. The town, once ready to turn its back, now found itself changed by her courage. Prejudice didn't vanish overnight, but folks couldn't deny what they'd seen. A girl who'd carried truth through storms and fear, and a cowboy who'd stood with her when no one else would. Now if you'd been standing in that square, watching Henry Talbot's empire crumble under the weight of a child's bundle, you might have felt the same chill run down your spine as the rest of Elk Creek. Because what Clara brought that night to Elijah Boone's door wasn't just a satchel of paper. It was justice. It was proof that lies, no matter how big, can't stand forever against the truth. And it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest knock at midnight can change the fate of an entire town.